Here we go. So, as I indicated, I want to speak with you about the Ukraine this week. I'm also going to speak with you about some other issues in the news, and I'll actually start there. But I'm going to frame this in terms of the question of whether strong leaders make strong states. And we've talked about this together in the past, that there is what's sometimes called a global autocratic wave that we're in the middle of, with the rise of strong leaders recently in the United States, or maybe I should say strong men leaders. And obviously, Vladimir Putin is perhaps the very mold in which a 21st century strong leader is cast. And yet, what the last 6 months, and especially the last 10 days in the Ukraine, have revealed is that Putin's projected strength, his strength as a domestic autocrat, the hold that he has over Russia and its media and its citizens' liberty, have not necessarily translated into military might or the capacity to build a vibrant 21st century economy. And so I want to focus on, in particular, what I think are growing structural weaknesses in the Russian military, the Russian state, the Russian economy, that Russia's failure in the Ukraine are revealing, and how it may, in fact, ultimately perhaps dampen some of the enthusiasm for strong men, if that is, people are actually calculating, do strong men make strong states? They may very well simply be, as often we are in politics, acting symbolically. We don't like the direction, not just that our country, our state, but our society and the culture of an increasingly globalized world seems to be moving. And so a strong man promises to stand athwart history and say no. Maybe that is all we want from our strong men. Before getting into Russia and the Ukraine, as I said, I want to spend a few minutes on other things in the news. And we are now 7 weeks from a national election, the midterm elections of 2022. And so I think at this point, absent some major change, we have a pretty good sense of both the play in the electoral politics, in particular the Congress and the contest for the Congress. In subsequent lectures, I'll look a little bit more at some of the interesting gubernatorial and state contests as well, a really interesting contests in Pennsylvania and Georgia, for instance. But today I'm going to keep the focus on national politics. And for those of you who've been looking at this week by week, and I think I've been doing this stuff intermittently for maybe 6 to 8 weeks now, you will notice there's a direction, a movement, and that is that the Democrats' chances have gone up, and quite strongly, quite dramatically, over the last 8 weeks. The Republican chances have been correspondingly diminished. And so it is still the case that the Republicans are favored to win the House of Representatives. The Democrats now have about a 1/4 chance of winning the House of Representatives. And on the I should note very quickly, right? This is in part as a result of a lot of gerrymandering, right? And so in many states, the Democrats will have to win maybe 55 to 60% of the overall popular vote to win even half of the congressional seats, because the maps have been so drawn to favor the other party. But nevertheless, the Democrats have a decent chance, actually, of perhaps stemming the tide in the House. And on the other hand, right, when we looked at this the first time, the Democrats' chances of holding the Senate were not much better than 50-50. They're now basically perfectly symmetrical with the Republicans' chance of winning the House. These diagrams, I think you're aware, are based on the averages of thousands of polls and then many simulated models, seeing how each race would turn out. You run it 1,000 times and you see what the most likely scenario is. And so this gives you a sense of the overall prospects, and it's built on a lot of data fed into some pretty complicated models. So why is it that the Democrats' chances of not losing power in the Senate, and maybe even just the slenderest chance of holding onto power in the House, are good and have improved? And here I want to start with some overall perceptions. How's the country doing? Now, three groups of voters who are asked this: Republicans, no change; right, the president's job performance actually gone down a little bit since July. And here I want to be as clear as possible. We are hyper polarized in terms of our partisanship. We are in hermetically sealed and completely contradictory news environments. I think there's very little chance that there's anything that the Democrats could do to change Republicans' points of view about Joe Biden's success unless Joe Biden at a news conference were to peel off his mask and reveal himself to be Donald Trump. There's just no way that those numbers are going to move. And if anything, I suspect Democratic success in governance drives down Republican ratings of the president's job performance. So what we should be really paying attention to is the Democrats and the independents. And as you can see, the Democrats' sense of the direction the country is moving in has literally doubled in terms of favorability over the last couple months. Joe Biden's approval has gone up substantially over that same period from the perspective of Democrats. And please note that independents, and that's really important, people who are not necessarily inclined to view this through a purely partisan lens, their sense of the direction of the country, 3 times as many people say it's favorable. Now, it's still low, right? But it is a definite improvement, and about 50% more now are likely to approve of how Biden is doing. I'll get to the explanations for this in a moment, but I think this is the basic change in opinion that is explaining the change in the electoral dynamics in 2022. Now, the next thing to see, and these are midterm elections going back quite a while to 2006, right? And the question that's being asked here is, during that election season, what are people searching for on Google? And this gives us a basic sense of what people are curious about, thinking about as they make up their minds going into an election. And as you can see, there's something very anomalous going on in 2022. In 2018, 2014, 2010, 2006, the president is the focus of most people's efforts to gain information. The president's rival in the previous election is almost never getting even 10% of the attention. But in 2022, Donald Trump, perhaps unsurprisingly, is getting 60% of the attention, more attention than Joe Biden, right? And so 6 times the historical average of other former candidates. And the issue here is that if you're in this news environment, right, then the question is, how do you think Bush, Obama, or Trump are doing, right? It's a referendum on the current president. if you're in this news environment, it's much more likely that people are framing their judgment on Joe Biden, not exclusively on the basis of Joe Biden's job performance, but also on the basis of the implicit comparison with the former rival, in this case, the former president, and in this case, also the likely future rival. And so this suggests that there's a different dynamic going on in this election. And that's where I want to focus for the next few minutes, some explanations for that different dynamic. I'm seeing a mistake in the slide. I don't think I'll try to fix it right now. But the basic explanations, I should have four. That's the mistake. There should be number 3 before Donald Trump's name here. First, the Democrats are doing better legislatively, and Joe Biden is doing better administratively and getting credit, right? And so the main topic we're going to talk about today is the Ukraine. And I think that in many respects, the handling diplomatically and in terms of the strategy and the effort to bolster alliances and isolate Russia on the part of the Biden administration has been near pitch perfect, right? And we're seeing that in Russia's growing international isolation. We're seeing it in the way in which the military aid to the Ukrainians seems to actually be turning the tide in the battle on the ground. We are seeing it in the growing strength of the NATO alliance, the expansion of NATO, and also in the growing resiliency of Europe, its ability to withstand the Russians playing with the oil spigot and threatening to cut off the natural gas and other petroleum products on which the Europeans have been so reliant. And so diplomatically, in terms of international relations, in terms of averting the rail strike, at least so it appears for now, and in terms of getting not only the initial success with the infrastructure bill, but now recent success with the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act. These are big, expensive, transformative pieces of legislation. They don't accomplish, obviously, everything that Biden hoped to accomplish, but he has the slenderest of possible congressional majorities. And the Democrats have managed to get this stuff done in a institutional structure that really favors bipartisanship, right? And with no cooperation whatsoever from the Republicans. So one thing that seems to be happening is that rather late into the first 2 years of the Biden presidency, it does appear to be an increasingly consequential presidency, and he is getting some credit for that. Secondly, there's the question of how the country is doing. And here I want to suggest most people answer that question in the first instance in a pocketbook way. How am I doing economically? And they tend to not only look at their own bank accounts, but to think about how they're doing as a surrogate for how Americans are doing or how the country is doing. And here I want to suggest we are in a real muddle, right? There's just, and let me give you a little bit of the data here. And I'm going to concentrate on the diagram on the right. This diagram, I think, is really interesting, really important. And if you look at it carefully, you can see it's divided into 4 quadrants, right? And so getting better, getting worse on the vertical axis, currently bad, currently good on the horizontal axis. And so this box here is bad but getting better. This box here is good and getting better. This is bad and getting worse. This is good and but getting worse. And it is often the case the various economic metrics in this diagram move together, right? So you would expect to see them clustered in one of the four boxes, all in the same state and moving in the same direction. And as opposed to that, right, you see them all over the map. And that indicates that this is a really messy economic moment we're in, right? And so just to point to a few critical factors: inflation, bad but getting better. And having said that, 8.3%, which was worse than what many economists anticipated. The data for August is not healthy inflation. And as you can see, the stock market had a terrible week last week. I hope, in a sense, you're not paying too much attention to that. But the reflection of the stock market on the overall economy is that because inflation has not been tamed so far by fairly aggressive Federal Reserve interest rate hikes, the Fed is going to have no choice but to continue to raise interest rates, and the result will be further dampening of the economy. And so investors are hedging their bets, basically predicting that we're headed for an economic contraction, a recession. And so that is something that is getting better, but not fast enough, and currently very bad, right? All the way at the end of the currently bad spectrum. The stuff that is currently good and perhaps getting better: unemployment claims, right? And I think we could say the job market as a whole, although job openings are good but getting worse, hourly earning growths are good and getting worse. And I'm going to focus on one more aspect of this, and that is personal income, which is in the currently bad and getting worse category. We've talked about this before, that wages are increasing, but they're not increasing at a pace to keep up with inflation. And so the actual purchasing power of people's wages is being eroded. This is reflected, and I won't go into these detailed diagrams, but these diagrams try to show you what things looked like in previous periods, immediately before and immediately coming into a recession, and how different 2022 looks from most of those previous periods in terms of both the job market and income and prices. But personal income being bad and getting worse, if there were anything that was likely to drive down people's opinion of Joe Biden and the Democrats, it seems to me it's that, and that is in that bad and getting worse category. So, right, ambiguous and muddled picture. Third, and sorry it's not numbered, Donald Trump continues to dominate the news. And so the election is less a referendum on Biden and the Democrats' performance than a two-way race between Biden Democrats and MAGA Republicans, right? And that's reflected in those Google searches. It's also reflected in the kind of Republican candidate who is prevailing in the national primaries. And we now have all those primaries complete. And what we can see is that in almost every state in the union, the exceptions are few: Iowa, Maine, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Delaware, and Hawaii don't have a election denier on the ballot. Every other state does, right? And the further prevalence of the big lie, of the claim that Donald Trump actually won the 2020 election, that Joe Biden is only president due to fraud and mischief, due to immigrants voting illegally, due to dead people voting, due to people stuffing the ballots, due to the deep state refusing to hold the election officials accountable for all this. Those kinds of candidates are the majority of the Republican Party. Let's focus for a second on the people who have fully accepted the results as legitimate in all of the major Republican candidates for office in 2022. It's 78 out of more than 500, right? Whereas if we look at the people who firmly and clearly deny that the election was appropriately decided, or the people who have said that they do not have confidence and raised questions, that's the majority of the Republicans. And then there's this other large group that just refuses to talk about it at all, right? So one of the things to see here is that one of our two main parties seems to have staked its position on elections that they are only legitimate and fair if they win, or that the only scenario under which they lose is one in which they will allege fraud. And this is deeply troubling for American democracy. And so when I contrast Biden Democrats with MAGA Republicans, I'm contrasting a party that says the other party has been taken over by people who are a threat to our democracy, with a party that says the other party is only in power because it cheated, and says that on the basis of absolutely no evidence and completely fabricated conspiracy theories, right? And I do think that this aspect of the election is also shaping the election, and it kind of bleeds into then the fourth factor, which is that abortion and other constitutional issues are altering the dynamic of this election. It is, as I've said to you, perhaps less an ordinary or normal American midterm election in which we look into our pocketbooks and out at the economy and decide if we like the job the party in power is doing. And when it's a single party that controls the presidency and the Congress, we almost always have a corrective and give the other party a chance. But in 2022, if the other party is saying, right, we only favor elections we win, one of the things you know about a party that says that is if it gains power, it does not relinquish power voluntarily, right? That's part of what election denialism is saying. And you then add to that, that the recent success of that party, and in particular, the dominance of its appointees on the Supreme Court, means that a right that was taken for granted until less than a year ago by many Americans, and was, in a sense, as rights are, part of the foundation on which people build their lives. The right to abortion, protected in Roe v. Wade, overturned in Dobbs v. Jackson, that right was taken away. The other thing I think people are focusing on in this election is, if we don't repudiate the party that put those justices on the court, where will the court go next? How can we send the message that this is not something we consent to as an interpretation of our Constitution? And I've spoken with you about this before, but as we see immediately following the Dobbs decisions, every major national poll swung in the direction of the Democrats, and by an average of about 3 points. And that is a substantial shift in a country where there's basic parity between the two parties. As we see when it became clear that the Supreme Court was going to uphold Texas's abortion ban, the voters who care about abortion say it's a very important issue. There was an inversion. It swung where all of a sudden Democrats said, wait, we care about this. The Republicans actually stopped caring as much. This is reflected then in the likelihood that Democrats are going to vote in 2022. And we'll have to see. We've had polls that have been inaccurate in the past. But what seems to be the case is that Democrats are highly motivated in 2022, and abortion seems to be important in their motivation, right? And so again, a kind of shift in the dynamic of the election may be also partially explaining the different results in the polls. So just a little bit more on abortion, and as I've said, the vast majority of Americans support Roe v. Wade. It's about 2/3. The vast majority of Americans support either full legal or legal access with some restrictions to abortions. And people build their lives on the assumption of access to abortion. They have sexual relations before they're married, before they're willing to have children. This has become part of the culture of the United States, part of our sexual mores and our way of life. This is what rights do. They allow you a sphere of protected autonomy, in this case, procreative autonomy, and people don't just turn a switch and say, okay, that's not available anymore. I'll stop leading my life that way. They've spent their whole lives on the expectation that this will be a protected right. And so the depth of disapproval, anger, dismay over this election, over this, Supreme Court decision, I think is something that we're still trying to fully fathom. All right, finally, the reason that Trump is in the news so much, the reason that people are Google searching for Trump more than they are for Biden, is that he is in profound, sustained, widespread legal jeopardy. Right. And we now know that the congressional committee will be scheduling new hearings that will occur in the middle of the election season, that the Justice Department has issued 40 new subpoenas, seized the phones of several of Trump's top aides. So it appears that the Justice Department's criminal investigation into the former president's effort to overturn the election is continuing to gain momentum. We also have lots of news with regards to the effort to hold Donald Trump accountable for having taken highly classified government documents with him after his term was over and having stored them in insecure ways. Who knows what else was done with them in his estate at Mar-a-Lago. As you know, a special master has been appointed by a judge. The Department of Justice is using a very narrow appeal to try to remove the requirement for the classified documents that they be reviewed before they are allowed to proceed with their investigation. The investigation in Georgia continues apace. The investigations in New York are continuing. And as you may have seen, the state attorney general, Letitia James, rejected the Trump offer for a settlement. And so it looks like that will probably go to trial. And if you're paying attention, the Justice Department actually opened a new and separate investigation into the Trump post-election fundraising operation for potential fraud. And as far as I understand, there are two aspects to this. Is claiming that an election was stolen in order to fundraise itself fraud, because you're lying in order to motivate people to contribute to you, and then is the way in which the funds are being used not to conduct political operations, but to fund the former president's legal defense allowed for, given what was said in the fundraising appeal. Now, I've got a quick prediction here, which is that none of these probes will result in criminal indictments between now and early November, when the election is going to occur. The Department of Justice has a policy of not bringing prosecutions against political candidates during the 2 months before an election. And although Trump is not a political candidate, he clearly is central to the Republican Party political operations. And I suspect by extension, they won't do it. And then I suspect that Georgia and New York will follow suit. So that and to be clear, I don't think that damages these efforts. I think that they can continue to investigate, continue to interview witnesses, continue to gather evidence, continue to put their case together. If anything, it may actually help them, but we shouldn't expect a bombshell during the next 7 weeks. So I'm going to stop there for just a moment, because like I said, want to speak with you primarily about Ukraine today, having just spent half an hour on the other topic. Let me just ask if you have questions or thoughts before I get into the Ukraine. And Flossie, I can see you got your hand up. Last time you did really well at unmuting yourself. Can you get yourself unmuted quickly? Got to hold the space bar down. Is there anybody else with a question while Flossie gets this sorted out? Flossie, I wish I could unmute you, but you're still muted. Do you see that little microphone icon? Dawn, are you saying you have a question or not? Were you just adjusting your?
Yes, I just unmuted.
There you go. Okay, good.
Very quickly, is Justice Cannon a loose cannon? I don't think she is. She knows what she's doing.
Yeah, so this is really tricky. This is completely unprecedented territory she's moving in, right? And by the way, I just showed you a slide showing that a former president of the United States is being investigated on multiple separate issues by the federal government and by 2 separate states, right? Just, spend a moment meditating on that. It's extraordinary, right? And so we don't have any precedent on this because it's never happened before, right? And just the total reckless disregard for the law by Donald Trump, which is a lifelong pattern, right? It's nothing new. But then you put him in the presidency where he has all that power, all that access, and of course it continues. And now we're left trying to figure out what to do with this mess. So is Cannon's opinion a good opinion? A lot of legal experts don't think it is. But having said that, and in particular, this is right, the decision to create a special master to halt the investigation until the special master has a chance to review the documents. It's interesting that the Justice Department decided not to appeal the broad holding, but only the narrow holding that they can't review the classified documents. That may mean that they think that this is a good decision. It may mean that they think it's not worth fighting over. And in particular, I think they genuinely believe that not being able to review the classified documents, some of which may still be missing, right, impedes the investigation into a potential national security liability. And so that's where they're concentrating. They're actually doing exactly what they should be doing in terms of not politicizing this. It's also what leads me to say I don't think they're in a rush to do anything between now and November. And so they can let the special master do their work. So no, I don't have the technical qualifications. And frankly, it's such an unprecedented area. We just don't know if that's a good decision or not. And let us hope, in a sense, it's a precedent that doesn't matter, because no future president is going to be so blatantly unwilling to abide by the norms and laws of the country. All right, thanks, Flossie.
I think
Anybody else with a question before we move on? All right, then, as promised, on to the Ukraine. And the week that just passed, really remarkable. And I guess it's now a little bit more than 10 days ago. This started on September 5th, sorry. And what this diagram shows, and I think it's a very useful diagram in terms of framing the extent of the Ukrainian gains in a week-long period, is that the Ukrainians captured more territory in a week than the Russians did in 5 months. And please note that we do not have reliable casualty data, but the good estimates are that the Russians have lost 100,000 troops to death or injury to claim this territory. And to put that in perspective, that's more than the Americans lost in every war since World War II, right? So the Russians, extraordinarily expensive campaign in all kinds of metrics and very rapid loss. And please note, this is not a meaningless loss. This is a loss of Izium and other critical cities in terms of the transportation infrastructure, which were logistic hubs for the Russian operation in the northeast of the Ukraine. And it does appear that the Russians beat such a hasty retreat that they left behind all kinds of expensive and valuable in terms of their intelligence as well, infrastructure, their command centers, their tanks, their aerial defense systems have all been captured by the Ukrainians. And so this could very well be a watershed or a turning point week in this war, right? And so how did this happen? How did the Ukrainians make such rapid progress? And please note, right, that the Russians have in the Ukraine more soldiers than the Ukrainians have in total. The Russians have perhaps the second, certainly the third largest, most expensive modern military in the world, right? The Ukrainians didn't have a military 8 years ago. This is David v. Goliath, and David just made huge gains versus Goliath. How did it happen? Part of it is that the Ukrainians have rapidly integrated new military equipment that really dramatically extends their capacity to fight modern warfare, right? And so part of what they've been doing, they've been concentrating actually their efforts. I don't know if you can see the little bits of blue down here. We'll get to that in a moment around Kherson. They've been really working to soften up the uh, Russian supply lines, military depots, command and control structures, and they've been using new weapons. We've talked before about these high mobility artillery rocket systems. So this is the detail of those couple little blue dots at the bottom here, and their new artillery as well. This allows them to strike much further behind Russian lines and with much greater precision. But in addition to that, right, so new equipment that allows them to do things that they simply couldn't do a few months ago. The other big factor, it seems to me here, is intelligence sharing primarily from the United States. The Ukrainians don't have the military intelligence satellites. They don't have the infrastructure with which to analyze the intelligence data. But the United States has been providing this. The Ukrainians have learned to trust the United States and are now sharing a lot of their information from their on the ground reconnaissance. And the result is that the Ukrainians learned primarily from us that the Russians seem to have in contesting, right, for Kherson, for this little region in the southeast of the Ukraine, redeployed a large number of their most capable fighters, their commandos, their hardened troops, and in part the people who were motivating or disciplining other troops to fight, redeployed them from the northeast to the southeast, leaving the northeast with tens of thousands of soldiers, but with very limited fighting capacity. And so when the Ukrainians learned about this, it's unclear whether the concentration on the southeast was really a feint. It doesn't seem that way, but we don't know enough. They very rapidly, this was a lightning strike, moved their forces into the northeast, and the Russian resistance crumbled, just completely collapsed. And this also then reveals a difference in morale, right? The Ukrainians are fighting for their country. They're fighting for their freedom. As we are learning, the catalog of barbaric atrocities committed by the Russians in the territory they control suggests that the Ukrainians are fighting for their dignity and humanity. And it is also the case that the Ukrainians are fighting to be part of the 21st century, part of the West, that the areas under Russian control are being dragged back into a 20th century centralized socialist model of governance. And so the Ukrainians are highly motivated. It appears that most of the Russian soldiers who were left in the Northeast are conscripts who really don't understand the rationale for this war, are highly demoralized. And when the Ukrainians are successful at attacking their logistics, their supply lines, their command centers, their military and weapons depots, they are also overwhelmed, right? And so in terms of fighting capacity, and then finally in terms of logistics as well, the Ukrainians appear to have taken a crash course in modern warfare, in understanding that modern weaponry is high-tech weaponry, that it involves complex integration of intelligence, and that you really need to master the technical details of your weapons system in order to use them. And the result is that logistically and in terms of fighting capacity, the Ukrainians are really outfighting the Russians. The example that sticks out to me is that the Russians have very advanced, very expensive armor on their tanks, but that they are difficult to install and maintain. And what we're seeing from the battlefield is basically the Russian troops don't know how to or are not sufficiently motivated to install their own armor on their tanks. And so their tanks are being destroyed by shoulder fired missiles that they are protected against because they haven't appropriately installed the protection, right? And so this is looking like something that is revealing of a change in battlefield dynamics between these two militaries. So a much less one-sided conflict, or if anything, a tilting of the advantage in favor of the Ukrainians. Now, I want to just concentrate in that area, the 3,400 miles that the Ukrainians captured. And these diagrams, I think, are very revealing, right? This shows a 5-day period from September 6th to September 10th, and right, where the Ukrainians started and where they were just 5 days later. Very rapid movement. But I also want you to see those red dots, right? That indicates satellite imagery that is showing smoke and fire. And what that means is that's where an active battle is. And in a well defended area with your enemy entrenched, you would expect that that would be all over the place, right? Lots of gun battles, bitterly contesting each mile that the Ukrainians are trying to take. And what you see instead is just really small, isolated pockets, some of them after the Russians have already fled. So what this seems to indicate is that the Russians really didn't fight. They just withdrew hastily in a disorganized way, leaving behind lots of equipment that will be very valuable to the Ukrainians and certainly very valuable to have out of the hands of the Russians. And so this is not just a shift in territory. This is a really good indication of the failure of the Russians to organize an effective defense of the territory it has captured. The other thing that we absolutely have to note, and Secretary of State Anthony Blinken put it, I think, quite well when he said, every time the Russian sea recedes, what we discover is mounting atrocities, right? And so this is in Izium, the mass grave of 440 people, some of them slaughtered with their hands tied behind the back. The idea that this is a criminal campaign, a barbaric campaign, that they are murdering, raping, looting the civilian populations of the territory they capture is not only a indication of the absence of 21st century morality on the part of the Russian leadership and the troops under their command, it's also a strategic failure. Because one of the things that you know is if you capture an area and you want not just to have it, but to hold it, to control it, perhaps to integrate it into your state, then eventually you're going to need the cooperation, the collaboration of the native indigenous population. And this is no way to secure cooperation. This is a way to secure resistance. And so one of the things we're seeing is also increased assassination of the collaborators with the Russian government, of the Russian occupying leadership in the territory it controls, because so-called partisans, resistance fighters, are recognizing that life under Russian rule looks like this. and they want no part of it. They're willing to risk their lives to resist it. The other criminal aspect of this campaign, very briefly, is the weapons that the Russians are using as cluster munitions, etc., as well as their indiscriminate targeting of civilian infrastructure and housing, right? And so what is left in the aftermath of the Russian shelling, which appears to be increasingly punitive, just trying to punish the Ukrainians for resisting at all, is dead cities, right? Cities that are really not worth what the Russians hope to gain from them. And so this then leads me, and this is where I'll conclude today, with a question. Is Russia fighting last century's war? And are the Ukrainians fighting a 21st century war? And so let me start with something I learned the other day. The term Donbass, and that's one of the major regions where this fighting is occurring, is actually a so-called portmanteau word, a word made by bringing two words together, the Donetsk Basin. Note that one of those words is actually an English word, right? Why is it called the Donbass? Because 150 years ago, one of the richest seams of coal ever discovered was discovered on this basin by the Donetsk River, and whoever controlled that coal was going to be in a lead position in the Industrial Revolution, which of course was driven before we really figured out how to use internal combustion and gasoline or refined oil by coal. And so the region that Putin really appears set on capturing is a industrial region. It has the infrastructure built around a large vein of coal. It has other mineral wealth in the soil. And I will just point out to you that, for instance, China is in the middle of trying to convert its largely industrial economy into a post-industrial economy. That Saudi Arabia, which is a petro state, is in the middle of trying to diversify its economy. But Putin seems to be launching a war based on what I would call a 19th or 20th century model of imperial resource extraction, not a 21st century kind of war. And having said that, the fact that Russia seems to be not learning from its mistakes, right? Remember, it launched a blitzkrieg. It tried to get to the capital, that Putin's own intelligence services seem to have told him that this war would be over in 10 days to a month, right? That the Ukrainian willingness and capacity to fight was much greater than the Russians realized, that the Russians' willingness and capacity to fight was much less than they thought it was going to be, that their supply lines got overextended. All of that you can see being a miscalculation characteristic of an authoritarian regime, where your intelligence services just tell the leader what they want to hear. But frankly, effective authoritarian leaders, Joseph Stalin would probably be the chief example here, figure out what to do about that. Figure out how to get parallel sources of information and to test them against each other so that they ultimately get good information, even from intelligence services that are frightened to give bad news to an authoritarian leader. Russia is not doing that. Putin is not doing that. And that suggests that the problems with the Russian military, the Russian state, the Russian intelligence, the Russian command system are structural, and so are not going to be easily fixed. And so that this war is going to continue to go badly for the Russians. And that leads me to think through a second question, and note that Putin has spent trillions of dollars of sovereign wealth, of the assets the Russian state gained through selling petroleum, natural gas, oil to Europe and the rest of the world for 20 years, he channeled that money into his military and claimed to have completely rebuilt a fearsome 21st century fighting machine for Russia so that it would never be humiliated again as he felt it was in Afghanistan, right? And what I think we're seeing is that this didn't work, right? That the Russians spent all this money, but they did so without building the actual military necessary to operate its war machinery. And this leads me to then focus for a second on the underlying question of the functionality of the Russian state. And to note that Mikhail Gorbachev, who died 2 weeks ago, right, concluded in the 1980s that a centralized command structure in both the economy and the state would not work in a modern, diverse, complex information economy and society. And this set Gorbachev on the path of glasnost, of opening and reform, and it ultimately led to the overthrow of the Soviet Union and the dismantling of what Vladimir Putin regards as the greater Russian Empire. So Putin rises to power in part as a critic of Gorbachev, saying that that whole experiment was a mistake. But it's looking increasingly like Gorbachev was right, at least about one thing, which is that a highly centralized, autocratic, authoritarian command structure in the state and economy do not work very well in our technological, information-based, complex society of the 21st century, right? And so again, a more structural limit on the capacity of Putin to adopt and do better. And so we've talked about this a little bit already. 21st century warfare is not the same as 20th century warfare. The reason the Russians ultimately defeated the Nazis on the Eastern Front in World War II is because they threw millions upon millions of soldiers into the front lines. I believe the Russians lost in excess of 30 million people during World War II. And frankly, almost anybody could drive a Russian tank and operate its artillery in World War II. But in the 21st century, as we've just noted, you can't even put the armament onto your tank without substantial technical expertise. And so the fact that the Russians have more troops in the field is not delivering them the kind of advantage that it would in 20th century warfare. And this means that, again, the Russians have a real structural problem they need to face. Fourth, there's a dilemma here, which is if Putin really wanted to succeed in this war, he would have to mobilize his society. He'd have to bring up a lot more troops, but he'd also have to convince his population that this is a war, not just a special military operation, and that sacrifices are required, that the economy is going to take a hit, that their sons are going to be put in harm's way. But he doesn't think the population understands or supports the war effort enough to go along with an expanded war. Again, this reflects the autocratic nature of Putin's regime, the fact that it relies on misinformation, that it requires only passive obedience from the population, that it does not generate the kind of patriotism, the kind of support necessary, the kind that the Ukrainians are showing. In the meantime, the Russian economy is really being hit by economic isolation, by the loss of the revenue from its petroleum exports, and by the collapse of its international supply chains. And so a further source of structural weakness here, the Russian National Bank just cut interest rates even further. The Russian economy has probably contracted by at least 10% since the beginning of this war. That in other societies would constitute a depression. But the Russian society seems to be, in a sense, so choked for information that it's not reckoning with this as a fact. Finally, Russia seems increasingly isolated, and it's losing the capacity to leverage global dependence on its oil. You may have noted there was a silent rebuke from China and a spoken rebuke from India this week of the Russian campaign. And this is, I want to be as clear as possible, not because Xi and Modi have all of a sudden become peaceniks, but because their domestic interests are being negatively impacted by this war. The spike in food prices is making it more expensive for the Chinese and Indians to feed their own population. The Chinese have all kinds of COVID problems in their economy to begin with, and now they're also getting an external problem from their ally, Vladimir Putin. And at the same time, the Europeans are making long-term structural plans to no longer be reliant on Russian fossil fuel exports. The Russians have been trying to use the fact that the Europeans depend so heavily on Russian petroleum as a lever or a cudgel to punish the Europeans for their support for the Ukrainians. And in a sense, that turns out to be a double-edged sword, because the Russians need the European revenues, and in the long term, they're going to lose those revenues. And I think, again, all of this would have been anticipated and might have been navigated a bit better if the Russian state operated better, if it was less simply one person using their judgment to determine state policy, as opposed to a complex administrative decision-making apparatus giving lots of perspectives and lots of information. Final and difficult question: how will Putin react to the recent losses? How will he react to the fact that finally Russian social media seems to be conveying some honest indication of what's happening on the ground, and some genuine criticism of the failures of the Russian planning and execution of its war? How will he react to the growing damage to his economy as well? Will he attempt to gain a victory, or at least regain some momentum in perhaps the only way available to him, which is through the use of unconventional weapons? The conventional war just has failed. And of course, that means chemical and nuclear weapons. This is exactly what Russia encouraged and perhaps even abetted the Syrians in doing, in order to turn the tide in their civil war. But I have to say, using conventional weapons in a European theater is an incredibly risky thing to do. In particular, I don't see Biden, the United States, and NATO simply standing by if Russia were to escalate into unconventional warfare. And so let me just add one more idea, and that is, I think the best hope here may be that there is growing understanding within the Russian state that Vladimir Putin badly overplayed his hand, and that perhaps the best thing for Russia would be a leadership change. And that if Putin attempts to further escalate this war, it might just be the final straw that precipitates a palace coup. I'm not confident. Obviously, anybody who says they are has a lot better criminologists than I do. But having said that, at least I hope there might be some internal restraint in the Russian military or the Russian state that would say too much if Putin tried to do that. All right, I'll stop there. Again, happy to take your questions, hear your thoughts. I do certainly find some encouragement in the fact that Ukraine is really beginning to turn the tide in this war. I just also worry about an isolated, dangerous, autocratic ruler doing dangerous and stupid things as a result. Who wants to start us out? I'm not seeing anybody. Okay, Flossie, go ahead. Or are you just saying goodbye? You'd have to unmute yourself the way you did last time. Remember where that microphone is? No, okay, fair enough, fair enough. Anybody else? Bob, go ahead.
I was just reading the other day things about nuclear weapons. And two of the major points were, number one, they are the big boogeyman, and that may not be deserved. Yeah, they're extremely powerful. Yes, they could, a single weapon could kill and or hurt a lot of people. But for instance, when you look at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those cities were nothing but wood and paper. And so therefore the bomb did entirely destroy the city. These days, cities are made up of concrete and steel. And there's a major possibility that nuclear bombs will not actually destroy them. Secondly, they tend to have a very small radius, relatively small radius of maybe up to 5 miles at most. And then thirdly, in terms of Russia in particular, nuclear weapons need significant ongoing maintenance. And the question is whether the Russians have actually been maintaining their nuclear capability.
Yeah, and I've heard the third point before. I have to admit that the first 2 points kind of have me wondering who it is that wrote this, and maybe you can send me the article because I'm curious. So I'll respond very quickly that the human damage of nuclear weapons, right? And please note that there have been multiple generations of Japanese birth defects of atrocious kinds caused by radiation poisoning, right? And so it's not just the damage to the physical infrastructure, it's the damage to the human victims. And then relatedly, right, the only times we've used nuclear weapons in battle 2 relatively small bombs, and one each in a geographically isolated area. One of the concerns about nuclear weapons is what they do to the atmosphere, what they do to the ozone, what they put into the atmosphere in terms of radiation that then gets spread through the stratosphere, right? And so even if they don't destroy an entire city, they may render that entire city uninhabitable due to the radiation and spread continent wide or larger in terms of their damage. Now, having said all of that, I do think it's important to note that the Russians are at the forefront of developing so-called tactical or theater nukes, right? As opposed to just intercontinental ballistic missiles. And so these are relatively small nuclear weapons that can be mounted on a truck and taken into the battlefield and then used not to destroy a large neighborhood in a city, but to target a much smaller area, for instance, a command and control structure on the ground. So maybe some of what you're reading is about the use of those much smaller nukes and how our typical frame of reference for thinking about nuclear warfare is the big intercontinental ballistic nukes, which, by the way, now are even bigger, much bigger than what we used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So having said all of that, I also want to point out that there's a norm here, and right, we're living in an era in which norms are being broken a lot. And part of what we're seeing is once norms are broken, they're very hard to repair. The norm since the dropping of the nuclear weapons in Japan is that this is unacceptable. This cannot be done. And let us remember, Pakistan, India, North Korea, right? Perhaps Iran is on its way. There are a lot of bad regimes that have nuclear weapons. I don't think we want to live in a world in which it becomes one of the options in the arsenals of modern militaries to launch nuclear weapons as a kind of routine calculus of strategy. So I have to say, Bob, I'm not merely trying to do the boogeyman thing. I do think that there are things to really be very frightened about when it comes to the use of nuclear weapons.
No, I agree. And, I certainly didn't fully agree with this article, but I thought it was very interesting.
Yeah, no, and it's worthwhile considering. It takes me back to the old days when I was doing Soviet studies. And this is the kind of thing that I was, for a brief moment, a fellow at the RAND Corporation. This is the kind of thing that you get in those kinds of conversations. Thanks, Bob.
Sure.
Anybody else for today? All right. So good being back with you. And I look forward to seeing you next week. And pretty soon we start a more sustained focus on the upcoming election as well. Please take care of yourselves. And we will be back in touch next week. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.